The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of the monastery as Marco Aurelius walked the narrow path that had been worn smooth by centuries of contemplative footsteps. At 35, he had already witnessed the rise and fall of 3 business empires, each collapse teaching him lessons that no university could have provided. The weight of his latest defeat still pressed against his chest like a physical burden, but something had shifted in the 3 months since he had retreated to this place of silence. The monastery of San Benedetto had seen many broken men seek refuge within its walls. Some came seeking God, others sought merely escape from the consequences of their actions. Marco had come seeking neither salvation nor sanctuary, but rather understanding, a comprehension of the fundamental laws that governed power, influence, and human nature itself. The monks, in their infinite wisdom accumulated over generations, had recognized in him not a penitent seeking forgiveness, but a strategist seeking knowledge. Brother Thomas, a man whose eyes held the accumulated wisdom of 40 years in corporate law before his religious awakening, had become Marco's unofficial mentor. Their conversations, held in the pre-dawn hours when the world was still wrapped in silence, had begun to reshape Marco's understanding of strength, weakness, and the delicate balance between them. The greatest generals, Brother Thomas had said during one of their early meetings, are not those who win every battle, but those who understand that defeat is merely information wrapped in temporary pain. The weak man seeks to avoid all conflict, while the fool rushes toward every battle. The wise man chooses his conflicts with the precision of a surgeon's blade. This wisdom had begun to crystallize into something more concrete as Marco observed the rhythms of monastic life. The brothers rose at 4 in the morning, their day structured with military precision, yet flowing with the natural grace of men who had learned to harness their impulses in service of a greater purpose. They spoke little, but, when they did speak, their words carried weight. They moved with deliberate intention, wasting neither motion nor energy on unnecessary flourishes. It was during his morning walks that Marco began to understand the first principle of what he would later call the Machiavellian edge, the power that comes from the systematic destruction of one's weaker self. This was not the crude self-destruction of addiction or self-harm, but rather the surgical removal of those aspects of personality and behavior that served no strategic purpose, that weakened resolve, or that created unnecessary vulnerabilities. The process had begun with silence. In the corporate world from which he had retreated, Marco had been known for his quick wit, his ability to dominate conversations, his talent for filling any silence with words that demonstrated his intelligence and knowledge. He had believed this made him formidable. The monastery taught him it made him predictable, and predictability was the enemy of power. Watch the novices when they first arrive, Brother Thomas had instructed him during his second week. They cannot bear silence. They fill every moment with chatter, with questions, with noise. They believe this demonstrates their engagement, their intelligence. What it actually demonstrates is their inability to listen, to observe, to think before speaking. The quiet monk learns more in a day than the talkative one learns in a month. Marco had initially resisted this teaching, his mind generating a dozen arguments about the value of communication, the importance of building relationships through conversation, the strategic value of verbal persuasion. But, as he forced himself into longer periods of silence, he began to notice things that had previously escaped his attention. He observed the micro-expressions that flickered across faces during conversations. He noticed the patterns in people's speech that revealed their underlying motivations. He began to understand that most human communication was not about the exchange of information, but about the management of social hierarchies and emotional states. The transformation was gradual but profound. Where he had once rushed to fill silences with his own voice, he now allowed them to stretch, watching as others grew uncomfortable and began to reveal more than they had intended. Where he had once felt compelled to demonstrate his knowledge in every conversation, he now asked questions that caused others to expose their thinking, their assumptions, their weaknesses. This shift in approach had immediate practical applications. During his monthly calls with his business partners, who were managing the remnants of his collapsed enterprise, Marco found that his new approach yielded far more useful information than his previous tactics. Instead of launching into detailed explanations of his analysis and recommendations, he would ask a simple question and then wait. The silence that followed inevitably caused his partners to fill the void with information they would never have volunteered otherwise. The market conditions have been challenging, his partner David would begin, and then, unable to bear the silence that followed Marco's non-response, would continue. Actually, I think we made some strategic errors in the product launch. The timing wasn't right, and, honestly, I'm not sure we understood our target demographic as well as we thought we did. This was information that David would never have admitted if Marco had been his usual talkative self, filling the conversation with his own theories and observations. The power of silence extended beyond information gathering. Marco began to notice that people attributed greater significance to his words when he spoke less frequently. His occasional comments carried more weight than his previous torrents of analysis and advice. This was the second principle emerging from his monastic education: scarcity creates value, even in communication. But the destruction of his chattering, attention-seeking self was only the beginning of a more comprehensive transformation. The monks had shown him that true strength required the systematic identification and elimination of all forms of weakness, not through suppression or denial, but through clear-eyed recognition and strategic management. Fear had been his greatest weakness in the business world, though he had never recognized it as such. He had called it caution, prudence, risk management. But Brother Thomas had helped him see that much of what he had labeled as careful planning was actually fear-driven behavior that had prevented him from taking the bold actions that true success required. Fear is information, the monk had explained during one of their pre-dawn conversations. It tells you where you are vulnerable, where you lack confidence or preparation. But fear becomes weakness only when it controls your actions. The strong man feels fear and acts anyway. The weak man feels fear and calls his paralysis wisdom. This insight had been painful to accept. Marco had prided himself on being a careful strategist, someone who analyzed every angle before making decisions. But, as he examined his past failures with brutal honesty, he could see how often his careful analysis had been elaborate rationalization for avoiding difficult or risky actions. He had delayed product launches until they were too late to capture market opportunities. He had avoided confronting underperforming employees until their problems had metastasized throughout the organization. He had hesitated to make the aggressive moves that would have established his company's market position while his competitors were still finding their footing. The monastic approach to overcoming fear was characteristically direct. Rather than trying to eliminate fear, the brothers had learned to act in spite of it. Their daily practices included deliberate exposure to discomfort, rising before dawn even when exhausted, maintaining silence even when longing for conversation, continuing physical labor even when muscles ached. These were not acts of masochism, but training exercises designed to build the capacity to act according to principle rather than impulse. Marco began to apply this methodology to his own situation. He identified the business decisions he had been avoiding due to fear and began to act on them systematically. He called potential investors he had been afraid to approach, fearing rejection. He reached out to former competitors who might be interested in collaboration, despite the risk to his pride if they were not interested. He began writing the business plan for his next venture, despite uncertainty about whether he would have the resources to implement it. Each action taken despite fear strengthened his capacity for future action. More importantly, he began to notice that his fears were often disproportionate to reality. The investors he had been afraid to call were generally polite and sometimes interested. The competitors he had hesitated to approach were often open to conversation. The business plan that he had been avoiding began to take shape once he committed to working on it daily, regardless of his confidence level. This process of fear management became the third principle of his emerging philosophy. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the systematic practice of acting despite fear. The weak man is controlled by his fears. The strong man uses his fears as information while refusing to allow them to dictate his actions. As winter deepened around the monastery, Marco's transformation accelerated. The physical austerity of monastic life had begun to strip away not just his mental weaknesses, but his physical ones as well. The simple diet, the manual labor, the early rising, and the long walks had burned away the softness that years of corporate comfort had layered over his body. But, more significantly, these physical disciplines had strengthened his capacity for mental discipline. Brother Thomas had explained this connection during one particularly cold morning when they had been splitting wood for the monastery's heating system. The body and mind are not separate entities, he had said, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. A soft body creates a soft mind. A disciplined body creates a disciplined mind. When you can control your physical impulses, the desire for warmth, for rest, for comfort, you develop the capacity to control your mental and emotional impulses as well. This insight had revolutionary implications for Marco's understanding of personal development. In his previous life, he had treated physical fitness as a separate concern from professional development. He had exercised when convenient, eaten whatever was available during his busy schedule, and prioritized work over sleep without considering the cumulative impact on his decision-making capacity. The monastic approach revealed these as false separations. The discipline required to maintain physical standards in the face of immediate comfort created exactly the same mental muscles required to make difficult business decisions, to persist through temporary setbacks, to maintain strategic focus despite short-term pressures. Marco began to structure his physical practices with the same strategic intention he brought to business planning. His morning routine became a series of progressively challenging exercises designed not just to maintain fitness, but to build decision-making capacity. Cold showers became training for accepting discomfort rather than avoiding it. Fasting periods became practice for delayed gratification. Physical challenges became opportunities to build mental resilience. The results extended far beyond physical health. His capacity for sustained mental effort increased dramatically. His ability to maintain focus during long strategy sessions improved. His emotional stability under pressure strengthened. Most importantly, his confidence in his ability to persist through difficulty grew, and this confidence began to inform all of his decision-making. This integration of physical and mental discipline became the fourth principle of his developing philosophy: the body is the foundation of the mind, and physical discipline creates mental discipline. The weak man treats his body as separate from his professional and intellectual life. The strong man recognizes that physical mastery is the foundation of all other forms of mastery. Spring arrived at the monastery with an explosion of life that seemed to mirror Marco's internal transformation. The gardens that had appeared dead during the harsh winter months suddenly burst forth with new growth, and Marco found himself assigned to work alongside Brother Francis, the monastery's master gardener. The lessons learned in the soil proved to be among the most valuable of his monastic education. A garden teaches patience, Brother Francis explained as they prepared beds for the spring planting. But it also teaches timing. Plant too early, and the frost will kill your seedlings. Plant too late, and the growing season will be too short for a full harvest. The wise gardener knows when to wait and when to act. This principle of strategic timing became central to Marco's emerging understanding of power dynamics. In his previous business life, he had often acted too quickly, responding to every market movement and competitive action with immediate countermoves. This reactive approach had kept him constantly off balance, always responding to others' initiatives rather than implementing his own strategy. The garden taught him the value of seasonal thinking. Just as plants had optimal times for planting, growing, and harvesting, business opportunities had natural rhythms that could be leveraged by those patient enough to observe and disciplined enough to wait for the right moment. Watch how the master gardeners work, Brother Francis continued. They prepare the soil long before planting season. They study the weather patterns, the soil conditions, the behavior of pests and beneficial insects. When the right moment comes, they act with complete confidence because they have done all the preparatory work. Their success appears effortless because their effort was invisible. This observation crystallized into what Marco recognized as the fifth principle of his philosophy: preparation creates opportunity, and timing transforms preparation into power. The weak man acts impulsively, responding to immediate pressures without adequate preparation. The strong man prepares extensively and acts decisively when conditions are optimal. Marco began to apply this principle to his business planning. Instead of rushing to launch his next venture, he committed to a year of intensive preparation. He studied market conditions with the patience of a gardener studying soil composition. He built relationships with potential partners, investors, and customers without immediate expectations, like a gardener cultivating beneficial relationships with suppliers and neighboring gardens. Most importantly, he began to develop what he called strategic patience, the ability to maintain long-term focus despite short-term pressures and opportunities. When former competitors approached him with offers that would provide immediate income but would compromise his long-term positioning, he declined. When investors offered funding with terms that would limit his strategic flexibility, he negotiated better terms or walked away. This new approach required tremendous emotional discipline. The uncertainty of waiting for optimal conditions created anxiety. The opportunity costs of passing on immediate benefits were real and, sometimes, painful. But, the garden had taught him that premature action often destroys the potential for optimal results. The wisdom of strategic patience was reinforced by his observation of the monastery's financial management. Despite their vows of poverty, the monks had created a remarkably sophisticated economic system. They generated revenue through various enterprises: artisanal food production, guest retreats, manuscript copying, and woodworking. But, they never allowed short-term financial pressures to compromise their long-term mission or their operational excellence. "We could make more money by cutting corners," Brother Thomas explained when Marco asked about their business philosophy. "We could use cheaper ingredients in our products, house more guests in less comfortable conditions, rush our manuscripts to meet deadlines rather than maintaining our quality standards. But, we understand that our reputation for excellence is our most valuable asset. Short-term profits that damage long-term credibility are actually losses disguised as gains." This perspective on long-term value creation became the sixth principle of Marco's developing philosophy: reputation is the ultimate currency, and excellence is the only reliable path to sustainable power. The weak man sacrifices long-term credibility for short-term gains. The strong man invests consistently in reputation-building activities that compound over time. As summer reached its peak at the monastery, Marco's year of retreat began to near its end. The transformation that had begun with learning to embrace silence had evolved into a comprehensive reconstruction of his approach to life, business, and power. But, the final and, perhaps most important lesson came not from the monks' teachings, but from observing their interactions with the outside world. Despite their withdrawal from conventional society, the monastery wielded considerable influence in the surrounding region. Local business leaders sought the monks' advice on ethical dilemmas. Politicians consulted them on policy matters that affected the community. Even international visitors, drawn by the monastery's reputation for wisdom, would travel great distances to spend time in conversation with the brothers. This influence was not sought or advertised. The monks made no effort to promote themselves or their services. They issued no press releases about their activities or achievements. Yet their reputation for wisdom, integrity, and practical effectiveness had spread organically, creating a form of soft power that was arguably more valuable than the aggressive influence-seeking that characterized most political and business leaders. True power, Brother Thomas explained during one of their final conversations, is not taken but granted. It is not demanded but offered. The man who must constantly assert his authority reveals that he lacks it. The man who possesses genuine authority rarely needs to mention it. This insight revealed the final principle of what Marco now understood as a complete philosophy of strategic personal development. Authentic power comes from competence, integrity, and restraint, not from aggression or self-promotion. The weak man seeks to appear powerful through displays of dominance, wealth, or authority. The strong man becomes powerful through the systematic development of capabilities and character, allowing others to recognize and acknowledge his power rather than demanding recognition. The application of this principle required perhaps the greatest psychological adjustment of Marco's entire transformation. His previous approach to business had relied heavily on what he now recognized as performance, the constant effort to appear successful, knowledgeable, and powerful. He had invested tremendous energy in managing his image, crafting his personal brand, and positioning himself advantageously in professional and social contexts. The monastic approach suggested that this energy was not only wasted but counterproductive. The effort required to maintain a performance detracted from the effort available for developing actual capabilities. Moreover, performance was inherently fragile, it required constant maintenance and was vulnerable to exposure of the gap between appearance and reality. The alternative was to focus entirely on becoming the person whose natural actions would create the desired results. Instead of trying to appear wise, he would develop wisdom. Instead of trying to appear powerful, he would develop actual capabilities. Instead of trying to appear successful, he would focus on creating genuine value. This shift from performance to development became the foundation of Marco's new approach to business and life. Rather than planning his next venture with an eye toward impressing investors or competitors, he designed it around creating maximum value for customers while developing his own capabilities. Rather than networking with the goal of promoting himself, he sought relationships where he could contribute value while learning from others. The psychological relief of abandoning performance was unexpected and profound. The constant anxiety of maintaining an image disappeared. The fear of being found out as less capable than his reputation suggested vanished. The mental energy previously devoted to impression management became available for actual problem solving and value creation. More importantly, this authenticity made him more attractive to the kinds of partners, investors, and customers he actually wanted to work with. People with substance were drawn to substance. Those who were only attracted to performance were exactly the kinds of relationships that had created problems in his previous business ventures. As autumn arrived and Marco prepared to leave the monastery, he realized that his year of retreat had accomplished far more than he had originally intended. He had come seeking to understand the principles of power and influence. He was leaving with something more valuable, a complete methodology for personal transformation that could be applied by anyone willing to do the necessary work. The methodology was deceptively simple in concept but demanding in application. It required the systematic identification and elimination of weaknesses, not through denial or suppression, but through honest assessment and strategic development. It demanded the integration of physical, mental, and emotional disciplines into a coherent approach to personal development. It insisted on the primacy of competence over performance, substance over style, preparation over improvisation. Most importantly, it recognized that true strength came not from the absence of weakness, but from the conscious choice to transform weaknesses into sources of power. Fear became information and motivation. Failure became education and resilience. Uncertainty became opportunity for growth and adaptation. The man who destroys his weak self, not through violence or denial, but through patient, systematic transformation, creates a foundation that cannot be shaken by external pressures. He becomes, in essence, anti-fragile, strengthened rather than weakened by stress, challenge, and opposition. This anti-fragility became Marco's ultimate understanding of the Machiavellian edge. Machiavelli himself had written about the importance of virtue, not virtue in the moral sense, but excellence in capability and character that enabled effective action regardless of circumstances. The man who possessed true virtue could navigate any political environment, any economic condition, any social context, because his power came from internal development rather than external position. As Marco walked the monastery paths for the final time, he understood that his education was complete but his application was just beginning. The principles he had learned were not theoretical concepts but practical tools that required daily use to maintain their effectiveness. The disciplines he had developed were not achievements to be celebrated but practices to be maintained indefinitely. The transformation from weakness to strength was not a destination but a direction. The strong man was not someone who had arrived at strength, but someone who was committed to the daily practices that created and maintained strength. The weak man was not someone who lacked capabilities, but someone who lacked the discipline to develop and deploy those capabilities consistently. Standing in the monastery garden on his final morning, watching the sun rise over the hills that had sheltered his year of transformation, Marco felt neither pride nor satisfaction, but rather a quiet confidence in his capacity to handle whatever challenges awaited him. He had learned to focus in silence, gathering information and developing understanding without the need for constant external validation. He had learned to strike with certainty, acting decisively when action was required rather than hesitating due to fear or rushing due to impatience. Most importantly, he had learned that the ultimate form of power was not control over others, but mastery of oneself. The man who could control his impulses, manage his fears, discipline his body, focus his mind, and act with strategic intention became truly formidable not because he could dominate others, but because he could not be dominated by circumstances, emotions, or the manipulations of others. This was the Machiavellian edge in its purest form, the systematic development of internal capabilities that created external opportunities. It was available to anyone willing to do the work, but it demanded everything from those who chose to pursue it. It promised no easy victories or quick results, but it offered something more valuable: the transformation from victim of circumstances to master of destiny. The weak self that had entered the monastery a year earlier, reactive, fearful, dependent on external validation, controlled by impulse and emotion, had been systematically dismantled and replaced with something stronger, more capable, and infinitely more dangerous to those who would try to manipulate or control it. This new self could not be destroyed by others because it was built on foundations that external forces could not reach: competence, discipline, integrity, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing one's own capabilities. As Marco gathered his few possessions and prepared to re-enter the world, he carried with him not just the lessons of his monastic year, but a complete methodology for continuous transformation. The principles he had learned were not rules to be followed but tools to be used. The practices he had developed were not rituals to be maintained but exercises to be evolved. The strength he had built was not an achievement to be preserved but a capacity to be expanded. The world he was returning to would test every aspect of his transformation. Former competitors would seek to exploit perceived weaknesses. New challenges would threaten to overwhelm his capabilities. Unexpected opportunities would demand rapid adaptation and bold action. But he was no longer the man who had fled to the monastery in defeat and confusion. He was someone who had learned to thrive in uncertainty, to grow stronger through adversity, to transform every challenge into an opportunity for further development. The Machiavellian edge was not a technique or a strategy, but a way of being in the world. It was the daily choice to act from strength rather than weakness, from preparation rather than improvisation, from principle rather than impulse. It was the commitment to continuous learning, growth, and adaptation, regardless of current circumstances or past failures. And it was available to anyone willing to make the same commitment that Marco had made: the commitment to identify and systematically destroy every aspect of the weak self that prevented the emergence of the strong self that was always present, waiting to be unleashed through discipline, practice, and unwavering dedication to excellence. The sun was fully risen now, and the monastery bells were calling the brothers to morning prayer. Marco shouldered his pack and walked toward the gate, ready to apply everything he had learned to the challenges that awaited him. Behind him, the monastery continued its ancient work of transforming men from weakness to strength. Ahead of him, the world waited to discover what a man could accomplish when he had learned to focus in silence and strike with certainty, when he had destroyed his weak self so thoroughly that no external force could find any weakness to exploit. The Machiavellian edge was not just a philosophy but a promise that any man willing to do the necessary work could transform himself from a victim of circumstances into a master of his own destiny. It required everything, but it offered everything in return. And, for those with the courage to begin the transformation, it provided not just success, but something far more valuable: the unshakable knowledge that no matter what challenges might come, they possessed the tools and the character to meet them with confidence and capability. This was the ultimate victory, not the defeat of external enemies, but the transformation of internal weaknesses into sources of strength. The man who achieved this transformation became truly unconquerable, not because he was invulnerable to attack, but because every attack only served to make him stronger, wiser, and more capable. He had learned the deepest secret of power: that true strength comes not from what a man can do to others, but from what he can do to himself. The monastery gate closed behind Marco with a soft click that seemed to echo across the valley. His year of retreat was over, but his journey of transformation would continue for the rest of his life. He had learned to focus in silence and strike with certainty. He had destroyed his weak self so thoroughly that others could no longer use his weaknesses against him. And he carried with him the knowledge that would allow him to continue growing stronger, more capable, and more effective with each passing day. The Machiavellian edge was not just a personal victory, but a template that could be followed by anyone with the courage to confront their own weaknesses and the discipline to transform them into strengths. It was the path from victimhood to mastery, from reaction to action, from weakness to power. And it began with a single step: the decision to stop making excuses and start making changes, one day at a time, one discipline at a time, one transformed weakness at a time. Marco walked down the mountain path, the morning sun warming his face and the future spreading out before him like an infinite field of possibility. He was ready for whatever came next, because he had learned the ultimate truth: the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. This was not just a philosophy or a strategy, but a way of life, the way of the truly strong, the way of those who would learn to focus in silence and strike with certainty, the way of the Machiavellian edge.